At the height of his power, Jay Gould controlled something far more valuable than money. He controlled movement. Railroads stretched across the United States like veins, carrying steel, coal, grain, and influence. Whoever controlled them could shape markets, destroy competitors, and quietly bend politics to their will. And for a time, Jay Gould sat at the center of it all. But the story of Jay Gould is not the story of a sudden collapse. There was no single crash, no dramatic bankruptcy, no public execution of his reputation. Instead, there was a decision, a single, deliberate choice that split his empire into two paths, one that appeared brilliant in the short term, and another that slowly began to rot from the inside. Historians still debate it. Some argue this decision saved Gould from total ruin. Others believe it quietly destroyed the very foundation of his power. What makes this story dangerous is that Jay Gould did exactly what a rational, intelligent, and calculating man should do, and it still cost him everything that mattered. This is not a story about greed. It's a story about precision, about control, and about how one decision can divide an empire long before anyone realizes it's breaking apart. But to understand how Jay Gould reached that moment, we need to understand why his story still matters today. Because this isn't just a 19th century tale of railroads and robber barons. It's a blueprint. The same forces that surrounded Jay Gould, aggressive expansion, regulatory pressure, internal conflicts, and the illusion of total control, still define modern empires. Corporations fracture. Founders lose control of what they built. Brilliant strategies succeed on paper and fail in reality. Jay Gould faced the same problem every powerful figure eventually faces. When the system you dominate begins to push back, do you protect the structure you built, or do you reshape it in your own image, no matter the cost? That was the question standing in front of him, and the answer he chose would quietly divide his empire long before the world noticed. If you enjoyed deep stories about power, money, and decisions that reshape history, stories where success and failure are separated by a single choice, this is the kind of story we tell here. And if you stay until the end, you'll see why Jay Gould's decision wasn't reckless. It was perfectly logical, which is exactly why it worked and why it ultimately failed. To understand that decision, though, we have to go back. Back before the railroads, back before the headlines, back before Jay Gould became one of the most feared and misunderstood men in American history. Because empires don't split at their peak, they split at their foundations. And Jay Gould was building his long before anyone was watching. Jay Gould did not grow up surrounded by power. He wasn't born into influence. He didn't inherit a fortune. And he didn't enter the world with connections waiting to be activated. He was born in 1836 in a small town in upstate New York, a place defined more by isolation than opportunity. His father was a modest farmer and tanner, a practical man in a practical world. There was no empire waiting for Jay Gould, no safety net, no second chances. What Gould had instead was something far more dangerous. He had patience. From an early age, Jay Gould displayed an obsession with numbers and structure. While other boys worked fields or trades, Gould studied maps, accounts, and ledgers. He learned not just how money moved, but why it moved the way it did. He wasn't interested in effort. He was interested in leverage. As a teenager, Gould became a surveyor. It was unglamorous work, but it taught him something essential. Land was not valuable because of what it was, but because of where it connected. That lesson would shape everything that followed. By his early 20s, Gould had already begun speculating. Not wildly, not recklessly. He targeted moments of imbalance, situations where information traveled slower than opportunity. He didn't rush, he waited. And when others panicked, Gould calculated. This was not the personality of a gambler. It was the mindset of a system builder. But even early on, people noticed something unsettling about him. Jay Gould didn't celebrate victories. He didn't boast. He didn't explain himself. He observed. Where other men sought admiration, Gould sought insulation. He preferred quiet rooms, closed doors, and carefully constructed positions that made him difficult to corner. That temperament would earn him a reputation later in life, one that painted him as cold, manipulative, even inhuman. But at this stage, it was simply survival, because the world Gould was entering was brutal. Mid-19th century America was not a place for sentimental businessmen. It was an arena, chaotic, unregulated, and unforgiving. Markets were volatile, information was asymmetric, fortunes were made and destroyed in weeks. And Gould understood something many of his peers did not. In chaos, emotion is expensive. Logic is cheap. His first real break came not from innovation, but from understanding weakness. Gould learned how companies failed, how poor accounting, overextension, and internal conflict created opportunities for outsiders to step in and take control. He didn't need to build something new. He needed to position himself inside what already existed. By the time Jay Gould entered the railroad world, he wasn't naive, he wasn't idealistic, and he wasn't chasing growth for its own sake. He was chasing control. Railroads were the perfect instrument. They were capital-intensive, politically entangled, and strategically essential. No railroad could exist in isolation. Each line depended on others for access, pricing, and survival. That dependency created pressure, and pressure creates leverage. Gould quickly realized that owning railroads outright wasn't necessary. What mattered was influence, stock positions, board seats, voting power. With the right structure, you could steer an entire system without ever appearing to touch it. This is where Jay Gould began to diverge from his rivals. Men like Cornelius Vanderbilt relied on overwhelming force, massive capital, public battles, visible dominance. Gould relied on precision. He studied bylaws. He exploited voting rules. He moved quietly while others fought loudly. And it worked. But it came at a cost. Every move Gould made increased his dependence on complexity. His empire wouldn't be simple. It wouldn't be transparent. And it wouldn't be resilient in the way a straightforward structure might be. It would be brilliant and fragile. By the time Jay Gould reached national prominence, he was already locked into a way of thinking, a belief that any problem could be solved with enough calculation, enough foresight, enough control over the variables. That belief made him powerful, and it would eventually corner him, because systems built on precision don't fail loudly. They fracture silently. And Jay Gould was about to build the largest, most intricate system of his life, one that would bring him unprecedented influence, and place him directly in front of the decision that would divide his empire in two. By the early 1870s, Jay Gould was no longer an outsider looking in. He was inside the system, deep enough to shape it. Railroads had become the backbone of the American economy. They determined which cities thrived and which withered. They dictated the flow of raw materials, consumer goods, and people. And increasingly, they determined political outcomes as well. Jay Gould understood this better than most. He wasn't building a single railroad. He was assembling a network of pressure points. Through carefully timed acquisitions, stock manipulations, and strategic alliances, Gould gained influence over multiple major lines. Individually, each position looked manageable. Collectively, they formed something far more powerful, a web. And from the center of that web, Gould could pull. Freight rates shifted. Competitors struggled. Markets reacted. What made Gould dangerous wasn't just how much he owned. It was how interconnected everything was. This was not visible power. It was structural power. From the outside, his empire appeared unstoppable. Newspapers called him a railroad king, though the title never quite fit. Kings ruled through spectacle. Gould ruled through absence. He rarely appeared in public. He avoided grand offices. He let others underestimate him. And while rivals focused on expansion, laying more track, announcing bigger deals, Gould focused on alignment. Who depended on whom? Which company couldn't survive without access to another line, where a small shift in control could trigger a cascade of consequences? At his peak, Jay Gould influenced railroads stretching from the Midwest to the East Coast, touching markets worth hundreds of millions of dollars, an unthinkable sum at the time. But scale brought exposure. The larger Gould's influence grew, the more visible his methods became. Regulators took interest. Politicians grew uneasy. Other industrialists began to see him not as a competitor, but as a threat to the stability of the entire system. And the public perception hardened. To many Americans, Jay Gould wasn't a strategist. He was a manipulator, a man who profited from complexity while others paid the price. This perception mattered, because power doesn't exist in a vacuum. As Gould's empire expanded, so did resistance. Laws were proposed to limit railroad abuses. Courts became more aggressive. Competitors formed alliances, not to grow, but to contain him. The system that once allowed quiet control was beginning to push back. Inside Gould's empire, pressure was building as well. His holdings were vast, but they were also entangled. Cash flow depended on timing. Stability depended on cooperation from partners who didn't always share his interests. And every additional layer of complexity made the entire structure harder to defend. To an emotional leader, this might have felt like danger. To Jay Gould, it felt like a problem to be solved. He believed control could be preserved, not by retreating, but by refining the structure, by making it more precise, more insulated, more difficult to attack from the outside. And that belief led him to a crossroads. Because the very thing that made his empire powerful, its interconnectedness, also made it vulnerable. A single shock could travel through the entire system. One misalignment could force him to choose between protecting one part of the empire and sacrificing another. At the peak of his influence, Jay Gould faced a reality few empire builders ever acknowledge. You can't optimize everything at once. Something must give. And when the pressure reached its breaking point, Gould would make a decision that looked like a masterstroke. A decision that preserved control in one direction, while quietly allowing his empire to split in another. But that moment didn't come all at once. First, the pressure had to become unbearable. And that pressure was about to arrive. Power attracts attention. And by the mid-1870s, Jay Gould had more attention than he ever wanted. What once worked in his favor, complexity, quiet maneuvering, and structural control, was now drawing scrutiny from every direction. The railroad system had grown too important to be left alone. Markets depended on it. Cities depended on it. Governments depended on it. And Jay Gould sat uncomfortably close to the center. Regulators began to act. State governments pushed for oversight. Federal courts grew less tolerant of opaque arrangements and aggressive stock tactics. What had once been legal gray areas were now being challenged in public. For Gould, this wasn't just inconvenient. It was existential. His empire relied on flexibility, the ability to move assets, shift control, and exploit timing. Regulation threatened to freeze the system in place, stripping away the very mechanisms that gave him power. At the same time, competitors were adapting. Other railroad magnates began coordinating their actions. Rate wars were no longer isolated skirmishes. They became sustained campaigns designed to weaken Gould's cash flow and force him into defensive positions. These weren't accidents. They were attempts to corner him. Inside his own network, tension was rising. Partners disagreed on strategy. Minority shareholders demanded stability over maneuvering. Boards became harder to control. Every decision now required negotiation, and negotiation slowed everything. For a man who relied on precision and timing, delay was dangerous. And then came the markets. Railroads were capital-hungry beasts. They required constant investment, maintenance, expansion, refinancing. Any disruption in cash flow could ripple outward, turning a manageable problem into a systemic crisis. Gould saw this clearly. He knew that if confidence in his holdings faltered, the entire structure could begin to unravel. Not instantly, but gradually, invisibly, until control slipped away. This was the moment many empire builders retreat. They simplify, they consolidate, they sacrifice growth for stability. But Jay Gould didn't believe in retreat. He believed in optimization. To him, the problem wasn't that the system was too large. The problem was that it wasn't structured correctly. Gould began to consider a solution that would reduce exposure, concentrate control, and create a protective barrier between his core interests and the growing storm of regulation and opposition. On paper, it was brilliant. By separating parts of the empire, legally, financially, and operationally, he could shield what mattered most, while allowing other segments to absorb risk. If regulators attacked one side, the other would survive. If markets turned against him, damage could be contained. It wasn't fragmentation, it was insulation. But insulation requires boundaries, and boundaries, once drawn, have consequences. Every empire reaches a moment where complexity becomes a liability instead of an advantage. For Jay Gould, that moment had arrived. He stood in front of a choice that would define everything that followed. Protect the empire as a single, interconnected organism and risk losing control entirely, or divide it strategically, accepting internal fractures in exchange for survival. There was no option without cost, and Gould understood that whatever he chose, history would judge him not by his intentions, but by the outcome. The pressure was no longer theoretical, it was immediate, and the decision could not be postponed. Jay Gould did not wake up one morning and decide to divide his empire. There was no dramatic turning point, no emotional breakdown, no moment of panic. The decision emerged the way all of Gould's decisions did, quietly, methodically, and with terrifying logic. By the time pressure reached its peak, Gould had already ruled out the obvious options. Selling out entirely would mean surrendering control to rivals and regulators. Simplifying the structure would expose his core holdings to the very forces he feared most. So he looked for a third path, not retreat, not confrontation, but separation. The idea was deceptively simple. Instead of operating his railroad interests as one tightly interwoven system, Gould would divide them, legally and financially, into distinct entities. Each segment would appear independent, risks would be localized, losses in one area would not automatically poison the rest. On paper, it was elegant. If regulators targeted one company, the others would remain untouched. If a rate war damaged one line, the core would survive. If public sentiment turned hostile, exposure would be limited. This was not desperation. This was engineering. Gould believed empires didn't need to be unified. They needed to be controlled. And control, in his mind, came from isolation, not cohesion. But here is where the decision crossed an invisible line. By dividing the empire, Gould wasn't just separating assets. He was separating incentives. Managers now answered to different structures. Partners no longer shared identical risks. Information traveled more slowly. Coordination became negotiation. The system still worked. At first. In the short term, the decision delivered exactly what Gould expected. Regulatory pressure eased. Financial shocks were absorbed. Critics assumed his influence had waned. But Gould knew better. He hadn't lost power. He had redistributed it. And that redistribution created something new inside his empire. A quiet competition between its own parts. Each segment optimized for its own survival, not for the health of the whole. Gould accepted this trade-off consciously. He believed that as long as he remained at the center, alignment could be maintained, that his intelligence and oversight would compensate for structural division. This was the critical assumption. Because systems built around a single mind don't fail when that mind makes a mistake. They fail when the system no longer listens. As the divided structure settled into place, Gould's empire appeared more stable than ever. Markets calmed, legal threats slowed, rivals hesitated. To outsiders, it looked like a masterstroke, but beneath the surface, something irreversible had happened. The empire no longer moved as one, it moved as parts. And once an empire begins to think in fragments, unity becomes an illusion, even if control appears intact. Jay Gould had chosen survival through separation. What he couldn't yet see was that survival and dominance are not the same thing, and the moment his empire split, the future split with it. Because from that decision forward, every success would be local, and every failure would spread in ways he could no longer fully predict. The fracture had begun. For a time, Jay Gould's decision seemed to work. The divided structure absorbed shocks exactly as intended. When one railroad struggled, another remained profitable. Legal challenges stabilized. Market confidence stabilized. From the outside, the empire looked leaner, safer, and more disciplined. Gould had bought himself time. But time changes systems. As the newly separated entities settled into their roles, they began to evolve independently. What once functioned as a coordinated organism now behaved like a collection of competing interests. This wasn't rebellion, it was optimization. Each segment adjusted its strategy to maximize its own performance. Freight rates diverged, investment priorities shifted, short-term gains became more attractive than long-term alignment. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the connective tissue weakened. Information no longer flowed freely. Decisions that once took minutes now took meetings. Conflicts that once would have been internal calculations became negotiations, sometimes standoffs. Gould remained at the center, but his leverage changed. He could still influence outcomes, but not with the same precision. Every intervention carried unintended consequences. Supporting one branch risked destabilizing another. The empire still existed, but it no longer moved in unison. Externally, competitors noticed. They adjusted their strategies accordingly, targeting specific segments rather than confronting Gould as a whole. Regulators refined their focus, learning which parts of the system could be pressured most effectively. The shield Gould had built began to show seams. Internally, the psychological shift was even more damaging. Managers stopped thinking in terms of the empire and started thinking in terms of their company. Loyalty narrowed. Accountability fragmented. Success became siloed. This is how large systems decay, not through collapse, but through misalignment. Jay Gould saw the signs. He intervened where he could, reinforcing control, restructuring agreements, reasserting authority. But each correction added friction. Each fix made the system heavier. What once felt elegant now felt complicated. And complexity, when divided, becomes brittle. The empire's two paths, growth and preservation, began to diverge. One side chased expansion, accepting risk. The other prioritized stability, avoiding exposure. Both strategies made sense. Together, they conflicted. And the conflict couldn't be resolved without undoing the very decision that created it. But by then, reversal was no longer possible. The division had changed how power worked inside the empire. Jay Gould had succeeded in protecting his holdings from external attack. What he hadn't protected them from was each other. Jay Gould did not lose his empire overnight. There was no single headline announcing his fall. No moment when everything vanished at once. The cost of his decision arrived the way structural damage always does. Gradually, unevenly, and without spectacle. Financially, Gould remained wealthy, enormously so. His name still commanded respect in boardrooms and fear in markets. But wealth was never the metric that mattered most to him. Control was, and control was slipping. As the empire's divided parts pulled in different directions, Gould found himself reacting instead of directing. Decisions became defensive. Moves that once shaped markets now responded to them. Each intervention solved one problem while creating another. Supporting a struggling line weakened a stable one. Protecting long-term assets limited short-term flexibility. The precision that once defined Gould's strategy began to blur. Reputation followed the same path. To the public, Jay Gould remained a symbol of manipulation, a man who bent systems for personal gain. But among peers, something more subtle changed. He was no longer seen as inevitable. Competitors no longer feared confronting him directly. Regulators grew bolder. The aura of total control faded, and isolation deepened. Gould had never been a public man, but now even private alliances became harder to maintain. Trust eroded as interests diverged. Former partners became cautious. Negotiations grew tense. At the top, there was no one to share the burden. This is the hidden cost of divided power. When responsibility fragments, accountability concentrates. Jay Gould carried it alone. The irony was brutal. The decision that preserved his empire from external collapse had hollowed it from within. He had protected the structure, but weakened the system that gave it meaning. By the later years of his life, Gould still held immense influence, but it was no longer coherent, no longer decisive. The empire existed, but it no longer obeyed a single will, and Gould knew it. He had achieved exactly what he set out to do, and in doing so, had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Because once an empire learns how to survive without unity, it no longer needs its architect. After Jay Gould's death, historians struggled to agree on how to judge him. Some called him one of the greatest financial minds of his era, a man who understood systems long before others even noticed they existed. Others dismissed him as a manipulator who weakened institutions for personal gain. Both views missed the point. Jay Gould was not destroyed by greed. He was not undone by ignorance. And he was not betrayed by bad luck. He was undone by a decision that worked. The decision to divide his empire did exactly what it was designed to do. It reduced risk. It limited exposure. It preserved wealth. In isolation, it was rational. But history does not judge decisions in isolation. It judges systems. And the system Gould built after that moment was no longer capable of acting as one. His empire didn't collapse, it dissolved. The railroads continued. The assets survived. The structures endured. But the central force that once coordinated them vanished. What remained was influence without unity, power without direction. Jay Gould's story matters because it exposes a truth that modern empires still struggle to accept. You can optimize for survival, or you can optimize for dominance, but rarely both. The moment Gould chose insulation over integration, he traded one form of control for another. He gained protection and lost coherence. And once coherence is gone, no amount of intelligence can restore it. This is why Jay Gould remains such a divisive figure, not because he failed, but because his success revealed the limits of calculation. His empire didn't fall to chaos, it fell to logic. And that may be the most dangerous lesson of all. Because somewhere, right now, another empire is making the same kind of decision, quietly, rationally, with perfect justification. And history is already watching. If you want more stories about decisions that reshape power, fracture empires, and reveal the hidden cost of control, subscribe. This channel is about the moments history doesn't forgive, and the choices it never forgets.